I can't remember exactly what got me started. I do know one of a real turning point for me was reading, there's a Humphreys, Groves and Mitchell report on environmental weeds that came out of the federal government. And I was just shocked by it, that these huge landscape scale impacts were going on from plants like bufflegrass, hymenacne, Parkinsonia and so on. I really hadn't realised. And I was seeing a lot of weeds as an environmental consultant. And so I started writing it in the 1990s, this book. And I think at the time I was writing it, my friends were sort of thinking, well, what's the point? Why, put so much of your life into that when we've got the world's best quarantine? So clearly we're doing very well at this. And the topic of invasive species, I mean, you're talking about cats and foxes, toads, blackberries. This is all really well-known stuff. But of course, it isn't when you try to write about everything. And so, I mean, it's a revelation for me. So, ballast water invaders, ships' hulls, the idea that there, if you look in rocky pools around eastern and southern Australia, you can see all sorts of marine creatures that have come often in the last 30 years, travelling on ships. I mean, people weren't really thinking about that, sort of like marine equivalents to the cane toad. And the weed issue. So, I mean, I mentioned that report, but the extent to which pasture scientists were importing they had imported literally hundreds of grasses and legumes. And all of these were designed to be able to take off in the landscape, and vast areas of Australia covered by those. The garden plant issue, people knew, I think at the time, that garden plants were problems, but they saw it as quite a discrete number of species being problematical. And really, there were just hundreds and hundreds of them. And I used the wet tropics as an example and was able to list all these plants that no one had ever heard of, Sanchesia and turbina, et cetera, et cetera. And so just to show that, the statistic that something like 2/3 of the weed species in Australia are deliberately introduced plants. That wasn't something that was recognised. And so, after the book came out, I was approached here in Brisbane by Barry Trail and Steve Matthews, two environmentalists from Victoria. And they said, look, we heard what you were saying. You were very critical of the conservation movement for not speaking out more about this issue, for not campaigning on it very much. What should we do? And so they basically asked my opinion about two pathways that you could take. One was to do what Barry Trail was then doing within the Wilderness Society, where he was running a woodland campaign to conserve the dry inland woodlands. He was getting his own source of funding. He was kind of basically running the campaign himself, but he'd chosen to do it under the umbrella of the Wilderness Society, which really pushed the envelope of what they were doing. And I favoured that as an approach. The other alternative was obviously was the way things went, was to create a standalone organisation. And in hindsight, I really could see that was the right approach. That you were never going to get really the big existing groups to take on this topic. So we had one meeting in Melbourne where I was flown down to speak to the Weed Society of Victoria. So we had a meeting tied in with that. Then there was the launch in a cafe in Melbourne. It was a really, really great vibe. And that was, I think, it was 3 years after the book had come out. So I could never have believed that it would be as successful as it is now. And I mean, that's, very much since you, Andrew, came to the helm. And so it's been quite a journey. I was an initial board member. I took on the newsletter as kind of the writer in the group. We have those newsletters on the Invasive Species Council website, and it is worth tracking down that first newsletter because, maybe I can write sentences, but I didn't know anything about design. So it's just a Word document, the newsletter. There's no pictures. The only colour is some headlines. But there it was, this sense that we were really going to do things. And when I looked through it, just a couple of weeks ago, what hit me was an article on black-spined toads. And I think that really symbolised what we were about, that a lot of people would say, oh, we've got to do something about the cane toad. And reality is that horse has bolted. There's very little you can do about it. It's amazing that something like $10 million was thrown at trying to defeat cane toads with almost nothing to show for that investment. Where something like the black spine toad that is now turning up on planes and ships in people's luggage, keeping that out of Australia, that's really, really cost effective. And that's the kind of space where we've particularly operated, certainly in the first years. And yeah, here we are today.
And here we are. Thanks, Tim. Gosh, that's 20 years ago. I think the precise day was just a couple of weeks ago on the 5th of May. And your book was so pivotal. So thank you, Tim, for writing the book and for taking it further.